Hello and welcome to another edition of Shattered Lives, the Irish Daily Star and Irish Mirror's crime podcast. I'm Paul Healy, I'm crime correspondent with both papers, and I'm joined, as always, by Michael O'Toole, crime and defence editor with both papers. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Paul. How are you? Welcome. Hello from Kilkenny.
Kilkenny, what are you up to today?
The 123rd Infantry Battalion of the Defence Forces are heading off to UNIFIL in southern Lebanon. So I'm down here. The Tánaiste Micheál Martin, who's obviously Minister for Defence as well as Foreign Affairs, was there for ministerial parade, a ministerial review today. So we were just asking him about the dangers facing the troops and that sort of thing. So I'm recording this from a car park.
Very good. Well, look, as always, we have, but there's plenty of other things that we're working on and you know, we will come back to hopefully doing podcasts on other topics, but we are still in the throes of this murder trial, the trial of Josef Puska. And today was the 11th day of the trial, and Michael, you were in the 10th day of the trial there on Friday, and we're going to sum up kind of both days today before we come towards the end of this trial. Possibly this week. So just to briefly remind people, Mr. Puska, Slovakian national, he is accused of the murder of Ashling Murphy, which occurred on the 12th of January 2022. He has pleaded not guilty to that charge, and as I said, we are now on the 11th day of that trial before a jury of 9 men and 3 women. So on Friday, there was evidence in relation to DNA, which we're going to go through in a minute, Michael. And then today there was evidence in relation again to the alleged admissions in the hospital, and basically an expert in relation to the medication that Mr. Puska was on, and whether or not that medication would have had any impact or effect on his ability to speak and on his alleged confession, which was 2 days after the murder of Miss Murphy. So I propose we'll talk about Friday, because we didn't get to talk about Friday last week, and you were there in court, Mick. And the first witness that we heard from was Dr. Lorna Flanagan.
Yes, so the evidence on Friday was really about 2 things. Firstly, the evidence of Dr. Flanagan, who works for Forensic Science Ireland, is a DNA expert, effectively. And then the second aspect, of the second tranche of the evidence that day, was about the arrest and charge of Mr. Puska after he was discharged from hospital in Tullamore. I think it was on the 18th of January 2022, so 6 days after Miss Murphy was killed. But as I say, the first tranche of evidence was from Dr. Flanagan. Now, Dr. Flanagan, as I say, she is a DNA expert, has worked for Forensic Science Ireland for 8 years and is heavily involved in DNA profiling. So essentially, she said that a DNA profile taken from under the fingernails of Ashling Murphy's 2 hands matched 2 samples taken from Josef Puska. Now, she had earlier told the court that the possibility of the DNA belonging to anyone other than a male relative of Mr. Puska was 1 in 14,000. Now, Anne-Marie Lawler, who is the chief state prosecutor, said that there is no suggestion that any of Mr. Puska's male relatives, because it was a male DNA profile, had any contact with Miss Murphy. And in fact, there was evidence later in the day that 2 brothers of Mr. Puska, Gardaí, examined their movements on the day that Josef Puska allegedly murdered Miss Murphy, and they very quickly established that they weren't anywhere near the alleged murder scene at the time of the alleged murder of Miss Murphy.
Right, so the court just heard how those DNA samples were taken from Miss Murphy's fingernails, and then there was a sample we know taken from Mr. Puska as well. So I mean, she determined that as you said, there's a 1 in 14,000 chance of it being any male unrelated to him. So it's not necessarily a 1 in 14,000 chance of him, but it's him or anyone related to him. Is that how the process is explained?
Yes, it was quite interesting. She said she concentrated. Obviously, she took the samples from under Miss Murphy's fingernails of both hands, and she said a sample there would be an indication of more than a social contact. So she said she took them from the fingernails of both hands. Now, she already had 2 other DNA samples. One was of Mr. Puska's blood, and another was what was called a buccal swab, or a swab taken from the mouth. So she said that the DNA the male DNA profile from under Miss Murphy's fingernails matched the two profiles taken from the samples obtained from Mr. Puska. And as you said, it was a 1 in 14,000 chance of it belonging to any male unrelated to him.
Mm-hmm. And she had access to a European-wide database in relation to that, I believe she told the court.
Yes, and Michael Bowman, as our listeners will know, he's a senior counsel who is Mr. Puska's defence barrister, and he asked Dr. Flanagan if the DNA register she had access to would have included samples from, quotes, ethnic Romani Slovaks. And Dr. Flanagan said that they would have been on the register. It's quite a large register from all over the European Union.
Okay. And we heard evidence on Friday as well in relation to when the accusation was put towards Mr. Puska when he was under arrest. And I suppose the difference in what he told Gardaí then from when he had earlier spoken to Gardaí in the hospital was of note.
Yeah, he was charged, and the way it works is you're charged at the Garda station. So he was discharged from St. James's Hospital in Dublin. He was arrested at the hospital, and he was brought to Tullamore Garda station. Now there will be some more evidence we'll go through in a minute, but after a day in custody, he was charged with the murder of Miss Murphy. Now the way it works is the charge is put to you, then you're cautioned, and then you're asked if you want to say anything in response. And when he was charged, the court there heard that he replied simply no.
He replied no. And then we heard this evidence, am I right, from Detective Inspector Brian Farrell. He was on the witness stand.
Yes, so Brian Farrell, he's a detective inspector, so he would be one of the two most senior, what are called SIOs, senior investigating officers. The other would be Detective Superintendent Pat O'Callaghan. They're the two real senior leaders of the investigation. So he was Inspector Farrell, who would have delegated, for example, people to go up to hospital to talk to Mr. Puska. He confirmed that in his notes, he referred to Mr. Puska as an SO or a suspected offender rather than a person of interest. We know that Detective Sergeant Brian Jennings, who interviewed Mr. Puska when he is alleged to have made this admission, would have called him a person of interest. Now, the quote from Detective Inspector Farrell in relation to person of interest is, "It's not a term I would use." So for him, it's really suspect offenders, and that's it. So he confirmed that Mr. Puska, as I said, he had gone to hospital on the 13th of January. We know that Miss Murphy was killed on the 12th of January. He was in hospital on the 13th. He was brought there from his parents' home in Crumlin in South Dublin. And Inspector Farrell confirmed that Mr. Puska was arrested on the 18th of January, so 6 days after the death of Miss Murphy.
Okay. And he said that there were suspicions that Joseph Puska was the man on the bicycle at that point in time when they wanted to speak to him. But I think that there had been evidence about the arrest of another man prior to them looking at Mr. Puska.
Yeah, so I mentioned Pat O'Callaghan, the detective superintendent who's above Inspector Farrell. So he was next to the stand, and he confirmed that there had been another man arrested on the 12th of January. That was the same day that Miss Murphy had died. Now, he said that man gave consistent accounts in 7 interviews. So he was held for a number of hours and he was interviewed 7 times. And he gave consistent interviews, or he was consistent in the 7 interviews of where he had been around the time of Miss Murphy's death. And he also said that those accounts were corroborated by the other man's mother and grandmother. So that man was released at around 10:30 p.m. on the 13th of January after DNA and fingerprints had cleared him. And we all know that roughly around the same time or just beforehand, Gardaí from Tullamore had first gone to St. James's Hospital to try to speak to Mr. Puska. That was, I think it was around 9 o'clock on the 13th. But they did not get to speak to him that night. They returned on the 14th, and that's when it's alleged that Mr. Puska made his admissions. But by 10:30, when the other man was released, the officer, Superintendent O'Callaghan, did say that at that stage, Mr. Puska had what he said was entered the frame.
Okay. And he said the view was that Mr. Puska may have been a man seen on CCTV on a bike, but at that point in time, he wasn't being looked at as a suspect as such, and then, as you said, their attention turned to him after the fact when this other mail was released.
Yeah, and he did say that nobody in the investigation team had laid eyes on Mr. Puska
Mm.
until Detective Garda Hogan, Fergus Hogan, and Detective Sergeant Brian Jennings went up on the 14th and spoke to Mr. Puska. But the superintendent was clear from viewing the CCTV on the day. He said, "I suspected that Mr. Puska was the male on the bicycle."
Okay, and then we heard evidence about the arrest of Mr. Puska, that he was taken to Tullamore Garda Station, and then as we were just talking about, when he was charged and what he said after caution, and he simply just said that word, no.
Yes. Very simple word. Yeah, so he was arrested. It was Detective Sergeant Brian Scahill who went from Tullamore to St James's Hospital, and he arrested, he said, at 11:31 on the 18th, 11:31 a.m., I arrested Mr. Joseph Puska for the offence of murder of Miss Ashling Murphy, he told the court. So then he was then brought, he cautioned Mr. Puska after the arrest, and he said he nodded his understanding. He was then brought to Tullamore Garda Station, got there 59 minutes later at 12:30 p.m., and he was detained overnight, and he was charged with Miss Murphy's murder at 19:42, so 18 minutes to 8 on January the 19th. And as we've said, he replied no after the charge and caution.
Okay, is that's more or less the evidence that was heard on Friday?
Yeah, just one other thing. Michael Bowman asked both that Detective Sergeant Scahill and another officer who was the member in charge, basically, was there any people outside when the guards brought Mr. Puska in? And Detective Sergeant Scahill said, "Look, I went to the rear of the Garda station. I couldn't really call if there were people outside." And then so it was Ciara Martin, who was the member in charge. So that was the person who's separate from the investigation team, who has to look after the welfare of all prisoners. And she said she was anywhere aware of any crowd. And Mr. Bowman then asked her if she left the station at any time for coffee or a biscuit. And Mr. Hunt, Tony Hunt, who's the trial judge, said, "This trial is about what happened in the ditch. What has this got to do with the ditch?" And Mr. Bowman's explanation for that was it was in relation to whether there was a crowd outside the station. So Garda Martin answered that she did not leave the station. So yes, so that was the thrust of Friday's evidence. Apart from one other thing, and I think you've sort of covered this, Mr. Justice Hunt told the jury at the end of Friday that the prosecution was coming to the end of its evidence. And I think Anne-Marie Lawler said more or less the same thing to you today, or to the court today.
Yes, Miss Lawler did tell the court, as the first witness was called today, that they were coming to the end of the prosecution's case, and then she indicated that the final witnesses would probably, some of them will be called out of order as such. So that's what she was flagging, that we are coming towards the end of the prosecution's case. Now, ultimately today, we didn't come to the end of the prosecution's case. Things have gone into legal argument this afternoon. And the jury were basically told they could go home and come back tomorrow afternoon. So we fully expect that the final witnesses in the prosecution's case will be called tomorrow. But the first and probably main witness of today was Professor Michael Ryan. And he is an expert in toxicology and pharmacology, and has been a professor in UCD, and is an expert of many years, the court heard. He was called in and to do a report ultimately on any medication and the general care of Joseph Puska when he was in St. James's Hospital. To remind people, and we have been speaking about it here, that when Mr. Puska was in hospital on the 13th and 14th, that he had interactions with Gardaí. It was on the 14th that he made this alleged confession to the murder of Ashling Murphy and said those words, "I am the murderer." So the issue that Professor Ryan was asked to address before the court was whether or not Joseph Puska was under the influence of any drugs that could affect his mood, or could influence his ability to speak, or could have affected him in making this confession to Gardaí. And in a nutshell, the professor basically concluded that no, there was no medication that Mr. Puska was under the influence of that would have that ability to affect him in any way.
So I understand that he gave evidence that Mr. Puska underwent keyhole surgery on the night of January the 13th. So that's the night before Detective Sergeant Jennings and Detective Garda Hogan spoke to him, and he made his alleged confession, and that he'd been administered morphine and another drug to stop any bleeding. But I understand the professor, or Mr. Ryan, gave evidence of what other medication he'd been given, including an anesthetic.
Yeah, anesthetic, fentanyl, a neuromuscular blocking agent, and antibiotics he was given, and he said that was all part of a standard medical procedure. He was asked about those drugs and just whether or not any of them would have still been in Mr. Puska's system by the time Gardaí were interviewing him at 6 o'clock in the evening the following day, and he said no, they all would have been out of his system by that point in time.
And I also understand that the professor examined the notes. Obviously, notes are always taken of every patient. So he
Yeah.
had something to say about the notes.
Yeah, he said that it was just the notes. These are all extensive notes. He said that were that showed the routine. He said it was all quite routine. That the medical professionals observed Mr. Puska and said that he was alert, that he was awake, and he was comfortable, and not in any form of distress on the 14th of January. And then in relation to the in relation to the drugs that he was alleged to have been given, there was only one drug in his system on the 14th. So all those other drugs that we mentioned that he was administered for the surgery, he said were out of his system, but there would have only been one drug in his system, and that was oxycodone.
And he did say that I think that Mr. Puska couldn't have had any more than 8.25 milligrams of oxycodone in his system at the time.
Yes, so the court heard, and Professor Ryan concluded, and he had done two separate studies that looked at the effects of oxycodone on patients in low doses of below 10 milligrams. And this is all quite technical, but it's just to explain to people that the issue at hand here was whether or not, and this is what he was being asked to confirm, whether or not this oxycodone would have any impact on Mr. Puska's mental ability. And he was basically saying this is very low dosage. The max dose that he would have been under would have been 8.25 milligrams based off a series of dosages he had been given that day when Gardaí were speaking to him. And the two studies basically concluded that they would have no effect on a person's mental ability in any way, that the drug in such a low dosage wouldn't affect anybody in their ability to speak or in their ability to think or anything of that nature.
And I think he told the court there was no evidence to support any notion that oxycodone had affected his admission to Gardaí or had any relation to his admission
Yeah.
to Gardaí.
He was asked that question directly by the prosecuting barrister, Miss Anne-Marie Lawler, and he said, yeah, no, wouldn't have affected in any way that admission. Just again, he said several times that these are very low doses. He was asked in cross-examination by the defence about that, and in particular about two doses that he was given in close succession. Mr. Puska, that is, he was given a dosage sometime in the afternoon after 3 o'clock, and then again around 4 o'clock. That interview with Gardaí was around 6 o'clock, so he was being asked, by the defence that because this is effectively a painkiller, right? He was being asked. Obviously, this indicates that Mr. Puska was in some degree of pain. That's why he needed a second dosage of this so soon after the first. And Professor Ryan said, "Well, look, I mean, it does indicate that that's a possibility." Yes. Professor Ryan was also challenged by the defence in relation to whether because he said that he had extensive notes, including Garda notes, and he was being asked, did he read all of the Garda notes? And in particular, the evidence of Detective Garda Hogan, who spoke about an interaction that he had with Mr. Puska and how ultimately the conversation with Mr. Puska had to come to a conclusion because he was in a distressed state and that he needed some form of medical attention. And the professor was asked whether he read that or whether he recollected reading that. And he said that he hadn't. But he did go on to sort of say his job was not to examine in detail Garda notes, but to give his expert opinion on whether the medication that Mr. Puska had taken would have any effect on his ability to speak to Gardaí or to confess in any way. And it wasn't to examine in detail.
But he did say that it wasn't that a detail, but Mr. Puska was probably in what he said was a probably stressful situation at the time of speaking to Gardaí.
Yes, because the defense barrister asked him, well, does that not strike you as abnormal that so basically Mr. Puska, Mr. Detective Garda Hogan said that Mr. Puska didn't recall seeing him earlier in the day, and the defense barrister asked the professor whether that would have struck him as abnormal that Mr. Puska didn't seem to remember meeting the Garda, and he said not at all. Sure, he was in a very stressful situation at the time. But from a medical standpoint, he said there was nothing unusual, and that this medication, specifically this oxycodone, wouldn't have affected his mental ability whatsoever.
Okay, so was that the end of the professor's evidence?
That was the end of the professor's evidence. It took up most of today. As I said, by the time we got to lunchtime, this matter, we were told, is going to go into legal argument. So we had some other evidence today, but the professor was kind of the main strand of evidence. I want to kind of briefly speak about a Garda who gave evidence just towards the end, and his name is yes, Sergeant Anthony Quinn. Yeah, apologies. Look at my notes here. So he's scenes of crime examiner. He also attended the scene. Look, there were multiple Gardaí that attended the scene. I don't propose to go through all the details again, but effectively, he is the Garda who put up the forensic tent around Miss Murphy's body and had other items of interest covered at the scene. He also went into detail about his involvement in the arrest of Josef Puska on the 18th of January and how he took fingerprint swabs and a DNA mouth swab from Mr. Puska. And he also was involved in taking photographs of Mr. Puska. And those photographs were shown to the jury this afternoon. And we were given a description of those photos, and they showed his hands, his arms, and his legs. And the Garda described scratch marks on each, and the jury were shown those. There was 6 photographs in total.
Okay, and just a quick reference to another doctor, Dr. Afan Bajwa. I believe he would have examined, or he met the accused at Tullamore Garda Station on the 18th of January after his arrest.
Yes, Dr. Bajwa, as he said, he attended Tullamore Garda Station on the 18th, and he was briefly called to just confirm his attendance there and that he examined Mr. Puska, and he said that he was conscious and orientated, and he was fit to be interviewed, and he had no active concerns about his health, and he left the Garda Station. Just that you noted, Mick, that there was evidence on Friday where a witness was asked about whether there was activity, whether there was people outside the Garda Station, and I believe the doctor was asked that as well, and what entrance that he went in. So that was brought up by the defence.
And what did he say? Did he talk about a crowd or anything? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it was noted to the court that, yeah, there did appear to be a crowd outside, yes.
Okay. So that was us for the day, was it, Paul?
That was us for the day. As I say, it went into legal argument in the afternoon. It's been indicated that we're coming to the end of the prosecution's case. So I anticipate, although you never know in a criminal trial, and we're not privy to what happens next, but we may well be talking about the conclusion of this trial this week. So thanks again for everybody listening. Thank you to Mick, and we hope to be back with another update tomorrow or in the coming days.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody.